Our next presenter is Kristen Paradise. She's a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist and founder of Pure Therapy, a woman, queer, therapist-owned clinic located in Hopkins, Minnesota. She provides psychotherapy in conjunction with ketamine to address grief and loss, identity and gender, anxiety, depression, PTSD, and other mental health concerns. Kristen is a death doula, assisting dying persons and their family through the end-of-life process. She is a past active-duty military spouse who has passion for assisting first responders, military members, and their families. Our next speaker believes in creating a comfortable and authentic space for her patients to explore and find healing through inner wisdom and external support. She has supported 200+ ketamine-assisted psychotherapy sessions and is a lead therapist in Minnesota's first psilocybin trial for treatment-resistant depression. Kristen is hopeful to incorporate psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy into mental health as a standard of practice for palliative care and hospice, allowing terminally diagnosed patients an opportunity to work through their existential anxiety. I think Panaeolus Bosporus would be great for that. Let's get excited, y'all. Put your hands together. Welcome this woman to the stage, Kristen Paradise. Thank you.
First, I just want to start by thanking everybody for being here, Big Psych and everyone else for allowing me the opportunity to come and speak about something that I feel incredibly passionate about myself. As I've experienced a lot of grief in my life, it's a topic that everyone will, I think, resonate with because everyone in this room has experienced it and will continue to through your lifetime. And I believe in also creating like a death positive space for conversation because death is something we avoid discussing when it is the inevitable fact of every life in this room and other things. So, first I wanted to just do some terminology with loss and grief in general. These words are often not always misused, but kind of like not used always in the best way. So. The first is loss, which is the real or perceived deprivation of something or someone meaningful. Oops. Sorry, I didn't know how to work this remote. I'm gonna pick this up too because I keep turning and, okay. And then there's grief, which is the emotion that is generated from the experience of loss. And loss can be anything from loss of employment to loss of a friendship, loss of place of housing. Anytime you move, you can experience transitional grief. And then there's loss adaptation, which is the process of adjusting to loss and grief. And so we prefer this as opposed to like coping with grief because grief is not always necessarily something you cope with. It's something that you integrate into your life. Moving forward, it becomes a part of your existence on things like anniversaries, birthdays, the day of death. It will still resurface. It doesn't mean that the grief is gone. It just means you've incorporated it into your life. And then there's bereavement, which is the period of sorrow following death. Now this is more specific to death itself. It's not necessarily grief. It is the bereaved. And then there is mourning, which is the socially prescribed practices or outward expressions of grief. And so when you see someone who's in despair, like a wife who's just been told her husband died and she hits the floor and she's expressing that grief right there in that moment. And then the different forms of grief, and I forgot to put a couple on here, one I just said, and then there's anticipatory grief, which is the anticipation of a loss. And so this generally takes place when there's, war and their soldiers may be going out knowing that there's an anticipation of their potential demise and their comrades. Or when you have a sick or dying friend or family member who is terminally ill and you know that it's coming, you already start to feel that emotion before it actually takes place. And then there's acute grief, which is the earlier phase of grief right after a loss that is very significant. It's when people have a lot of depression symptoms actually, where you will be like having difficulty with concentration or loss of appetite, loss of sleep. And then there's the complicated, or prolonged grief, which is like the acute grief extended. And so there's, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, there's a saying about like a year in mourning, how you're supposed to have a year, move beyond that, which is unrealistic because grief lasts an entire lifetime. But when that acute phase goes into, a year or more, when you're still really just unable to function in your life and you can't seem to move beyond or through that thing how you'd hoped, then it becomes complicated or prolonged. And I did want to say, when it comes to these two, when it comes to psychedelics and using them, it is not always recommended to do that in the acute grief phase, because that is the phase where you are really feeling those very intense emotions. And if you actually try to, say, put a psychedelic into the mix there, that actually is called spiritually bypassing it. And so you will be trying to fast forward yourself through that grief when you kind of need to let that organic piece of it move through a bit before trying to add something like medicine to help you get out of the prolonged or complicated grief. And then there's the integrated grief, which is integrating the grief into your life as a part of it and kind of finding more of an acceptance for the loss and integrating it in ways like honoring the person on the day of their death or the day of their birth or a special day for you. Something I do with my friends even, I have a friend who we've lost several people together throughout time, so we take those days and then her and I, because we're still here, we go and we have dinner or we celebrate that person and we honor them with memories and pictures and songs. And then there is traumatic grief, which is the sudden loss of a person or an object or something you did not see it coming, you did not expect it, and all of a sudden it is no longer there. That is a very different type of grief that can feel incredibly crippling when you don't see that coming. And then there's also, which I did not put on here, compounded grief. And so something like that would be grief or loss stacked on top of each other. So say you lose one person and then 6 months later you lose another and then you lose your job and then your dog dies. You have the compounded just one on top of the other. Okay. So these are two different interventions that we would use therapeutically. Doesn't mean they apply to every patient. Every patient, for me anyway, has the care that is applicable to them. I don't assume this works for everyone. And so the meaning reconstruction after loss is what helps access memories and pivotal events that have negatively altered the reward system. So this is where psychedelics can actually come in and be really cool because it's doing the opposite of that, basically. And then it offers the brain a path to reconstruct them in a positive way by making meaning of it or creating a new way to experience and feel that grief within yourself. And then there is restorative retelling, which helps empower some sense making of maybe the loss itself, and then retelling of the experience and adjusting present perspective in a way that serves the individual so that they can learn to carry their grief with them differently. And I believe that we can even use our grief for beautiful benefit. If it weren't for that, I wouldn't be standing here today talking to all of you, actually. So then this is the psychedelic therapy component to the grief and loss that we experience. How it is a catalyst to the meaning reconstruction. So the two interventions I just mentioned, when you add psychedelics into that as a component, it can help people maybe lower their inhibitions about it and maybe view that loss differently. And then it also encourages the self-exploration within the context of that by taking pieces of what was to create and admire what now is. And so it's like honoring the past and the present all at the same time. And then psychedelics will help the individuals accept their feelings as well, to stop pushing against them, which is incredibly common with grief. I'm sure we've all had to even do that in certain maybe public settings where we're feeling it and we just can't really show it. We fight against it. We don't want to feel it because grief, as some of you may know, can be very, very overwhelming. And then it helps you to find empowerment in that as well. So connection is an aspect of grief and psychedelics, and how these medicines create a venue to pass through and filter the mind. They open up the subconscious aspect and allow you to sit a little bit differently in that space with your grief, to face it almost. I actually met a woman last night who said psychedelics helped her to face her grief as if it was someone standing right in front of her, and actually like talk to it and then build a relationship with it and move beyond that. Not beyond, but through. I think it is something that is sacred. It touches the core of our human existence. I think grief and psychedelics both do that to us. It actually, both of these things can change the structure of our brain. Psychedelics disrupt the patterns and allow the brain to operate in new ways that weren't otherwise possible before, and connect more with the self, others, and the universe. That connection, when speaking of grief or loss, especially death-related, I have seen people who lost folks, and then during the psychedelic experience, that person showed up and said, "It's okay, I'm okay now, you can go on and live your life, and I want you to." And so it's been really beautiful to see that happen for folks. So then there's the neuroplasticity. I'm sure a lot of people in here know what this is already, but this is what allows the brain to compensate for injury, illness, loss, and other life-altering traumatic events by forming new neural connections based on these experiences. Now, this goes for negative and positive experiences in your life. So this is kind of where the grief and psychedelic component comes in as well. It helps you to adapt to the situations when you are under the influence of that psychedelic. Your brain is trying to create those pathways to create and maybe enter in some positive memories or ideas. And then grief itself goes into that state with that neuroplasticity. It disrupts the diverse cognitive domains of memory, decision-making, function, attention. That was what I was saying earlier too, appetite. People often don't eat or sleep. We just kind of, self-care goes out the window when we're in that deep state of grief. So psychedelics help the synapses to regrow and heal, changing the structure of the brain, allowing a way out of the loop of despair we feel with grief, which is why it goes into that complicated grief space, because you are in that loop. Your brain has almost solidified this response to that loss. And so how do we break that? By maybe helping create some neural pathways and incorporating some different perspective around the loss. This one I love. I feel like I say this a lot in my work, and this is something I've also learned as a person. So grief and love are not just intricately connected, but are one and the same. Anyone here who's experienced grief will probably be able to tell you it's pretty equivalent to the thing or person that we lost, depending on how much we love that thing, you know. Grief is love and confusion caused by not knowing how to love the person who's gone. So we all have this energetic aspect of ourselves that we give to everyone. You've all given it to me by being here listening to me. You've chosen to give me that energy. I'm choosing to give that as well. And when there is nothing to give that to all of a sudden, we don't know what to do with that or where to direct it. And so something that I think of when I think of that is I don't know what to do with it, and so I hug my dog because they can take that. And then I just give all the love to them. It is the frustration and bitterness and the resentment, because death can often cause destruction in our life. It causes significant change. Maybe we didn't expect it. And that can be really difficult to deal with. And then like I was just saying, we grieve in proportion. If we allow ourselves to love, we must also allow ourselves to express grief. I think that culturally we have walked away from things like that a lot, of like permission to grieve. Often people hide it. They don't talk about it. They don't want to talk about it because if they do, it brings all of that back to the surface. There are actually really cool places in the Twin Cities, just to kind of talk about that a little bit, of just like talking about it in general or about death in general. There are these things called death cafes in the Twin Cities. I don't know if you've ever heard of those. I know Lakewood Cemetery does one, and then there's another one at the Rogue Buddha Gallery in Northeast Minneapolis. And it is actually a place for community to come together and talk about death as a topic. It's not a grief group or like a therapy group in any way. It's just a community of people who want to talk about this topic, which I think a lot of people do, but they don't know where to put it or where it will land. You can't always just tell your friends and family, oh, hey, let's talk about death today. People aren't always responsive to that. Trust me, because I do it all the time when I walk into anywhere. I actually have a card game called the Death Deck that I bring to dinner with my friends and we play it. Yeah, exactly. All right, and then there's the dealing with grief. So the acknowledgement of the pain itself. I don't think we can really allow ourselves to feel it unless we acknowledge that it's there. Once we do that, then it's a little bit easier to allow yourself to feel and move through that. And then accepting that it can trigger many different and unexpected emotions. And this can be lifelong. This is not limited to the initial phases of it. It can be 10, 20 years in the future, and you can kind of go right back into that again as if you just felt it freshly. And then understanding that every grieving process is unique. So every person in this room, although there may be similar responses statistically that we can show, no one in here will experience it identically. Some people show it in anger, some people get quiet, some people work more, some people work less. There's just so many different ways that we all deal with all of that. And then I would encourage everyone, if that is the case, to seek support from people in your personal life, from colleagues if you can, from therapists, from anyone who can hold that space for you to talk about it. I would say something I encourage for folks to do if they do want to engage in conversations like that and they're not sure, just ask. That's generally how I start those conversations. Like, are you okay hearing this thing that I want to share? And then you know if they have the capacity to hold that for you. And then there's the supporting yourself by taking care of yourself physically. So I had to learn this hard lesson when I went through some pretty bad grief a few years ago, where I knew what the things were that people would stop doing. They'd stop eating, they'd stop sleeping, they'd stop taking care of themselves. And so I very intentionally every day would like cook breakfast even if I didn't want to eat it, even if I only ate a couple bites. And I would make sure I walked my dogs every day and make sure I was doing all these things because I knew that would be the first thing to go. And if I could kind of keep up with some of that, it would help me move through the process a bit. And then there is the difference between grief and depression. And this is very intertwined because that complicated grief especially, and especially that acute grief, is very resemblant of depression. The DSM, which none of us really actually even like, just so you guys know, they wouldn't recognize grief diagnosably. So, and then we weren't allowed to diagnose depression if it was related to grief, and so it's just ridiculous. And so we have to work our way around that, obviously for insurance reasons and things, for therapy to be covered. But there's a significant similarity. They're so similar, actually. I mean, depression, the symptoms, lack of concentration, appetite, sleep, all the things we lose, they're very similar. And so I think the depression more so is like in that complicated, like you're still in that. You just like cannot seem to get yourself through that thing. And that's when I recommend, therapy or psychedelics or something like that to kind of get you through it. And then I wanted to just provide some information if anybody was interested in going through this process in this way at all. These are the local clinics. There's a couple of them here that have some booths out in the lobby area. And so there are people there that you could speak to. There are several people that work at these clinics that are here today as well. If you wanted to talk to any of them, they'd be able to help you understand how this works and the dynamics of all of it. And that's really it. And I don't know how much time I have left, but all right. I know I have a long time. Some death doula stories. Okay. I should have brought my death deck. I thought about it, actually, to just play it and ask questions from it, because they're pretty good. Death doula stories. So, let's see, what led me to that path, first of all, was my own experiences in loss and grief. And when I went through those experiences when I was younger, I think it was really foreign to the people in my life who didn't really necessarily understand or know how to support me in that stuff. And so I grew up in a Catholic upbringing as well. And in that upbringing, they tend to, here's the funeral, here's the wake, we bury the person, and then it's just kind of done. There's not a lot of talking about it or honoring that stuff. And that was really difficult for me when I started to lose people, because I did want to talk about it and I wanted support, and I felt like the community I was in just didn't really know how to give that, and this goes into obviously generational things in my own family as well, of just them not knowing how to support those dynamics. Even now, a lot of the people in my family are alive, and so they haven't experienced a lot of that, so they didn't know how to support it. And so in that, and going through all of that, it really made me want to talk about it and help other people talk about it, because I think that we often don't, and we really should. And so then that led me into just kind of the end of life death doula ideas and work, because I've always really enjoyed this topic. Even before doing psychedelic therapy, I did a lot of focus on like gender identity and things clinically. And then even when I was in my graduate program, I was living overseas and I was Googling like, where can I work in a funeral home and do therapy and help people? And then come to today, when you have psychedelic medicine and that, and how those are so intertwined, is just really beautiful to be in this space, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. But like death doula stories, I can think of like, just to kind of give an idea of like what it's like to be in that space with folks when they're dying. I had a family that I had gone to see. There was a married couple, and one of them was dying, and the siblings, like their children and everything, were in the room, and both of these persons partnered were in the same care facility, but one was dying sooner than the other. And I could tell that there was discomfort in that space. There's always really like, I don't really know what to do or how to behave or what to say or not. And so I just kind of sat down in the room, because the last thing to go when someone dies is their hearing. And so they can actually hear a lot. They may appear to be sleeping, but that does not mean that they can't hear you actually. And so what I did is I kind of just sat down with the kids, who were all my age, mind you. And I just said, hey, what is a memory about this person that you have that you want to maybe share with me? So they could do it out loud and they could also hear it. So it's kind of like you get to be this like, not psychic medium, but a medium between those two things in a way, where you get to kind of sit and just open those things up for people who maybe don't feel comfortable doing that. And then it was actually really beautiful, because the partner who was in their room on the other side of the building before I left, I was like, I have to go and talk to them, because I really feel that their partner doesn't even have 24 hours, right? And so when you go through these trainings, you learn about all these signs and at the end of life and kind of what to expect and see. And so as soon as I had come into the room and saw the state of the person, I knew that they maybe had 24 hours. But that also is like a weird educated guess. You're not always accurate, so it's a very strange thing to speak on. And so I went into the partner's room and I just said, you know, how come you're not in there? And they said they weren't incredibly comfortable being in there and kind of seeing them that way. And I was like, I need to help you understand and encourage you to please go in there and just spend even a little bit of time, because I don't think they have more than 24 hours. And even when that came out of my mouth, I remember thinking, oh God, you don't even know. You have no idea. Like, you see that, but you may not be right. What if he lives a couple more days, you know? And so I sat and kind of talked with her, and as I left and was getting into the elevator, what I saw was the 2 children and the wife, and they were walking her into the room to go visit with him. And right before that, she goes, well, this lady told me I have to go in there because he doesn't have much longer. And I thought, oh God, that's pressure on me. And so I see them walking out. I parted ways quietly, went onto the elevator, left, and then I got a call the next morning that he died. And so it was really beautiful to be able to just be a part of something like that. I feel incredibly grateful and honored to be with people at the end of their life, and to be with their families, and to help the families understand, like, it is okay to talk about this stuff, and it is okay to honor this person even though they're still here, by sharing stories with them about what they meant to you. Yeah, that was the story. Okay. If anybody has questions, we could do, I don't know if they want people to come to the mic, I think. Okay. Yeah. There's 2, okay. Yeah. Hi.
Hello? Okay. So with death comes rebirth, and I'm wondering how, through your work, you've felt reborn again and again. And I'm also wondering how your relationship with your own mortality has evolved through your career.
Yes. So I kind of forgot the first part of the question. So my own acceptance of my mortality has changed tremendously. I will say, even probably in my early to mid 20s, I had extreme death anxiety about anyone around me dying, about myself dying, about death in general. I didn't even want to talk about it, which is why I think it's so important to talk about it, because I never felt okay with that. And because it has allowed me to talk about it more, it helps me to sit with my own differently, if that makes sense. Like, the more, that's why I encourage, like, and advocate for talking about death in general, or loss, because the more we can develop a relationship with that ourselves, I think we can carry that on into other things. Kind of like I was saying, like, I wouldn't be up here if I hadn't experienced that myself. And so I've formed a relationship with it and kind of just let it be a part of me, which has been really beautiful. I can't remember the first part of your question. Oh, yes. Yes. Okay, the rebirth. So that is a really good question, actually, because death is very similar to birth. And I actually know someone who lost their father a couple weeks ago. And when they came back to town, I sat down and I said, I'm going to ask you questions. If you need to stop me, please just stop me, because I'm going to just keep going until you tell me not to, because I'm always curious. And so one of the things that he said to me was, you know, it was really beautiful to watch, and it was tremendous to actually see how that dying process resembles birth so very much as well. And so it's the next phase. As we come into this world, we actually exit it, and that journey looks very, very similar. And being closer to these things, and to your question with the rebirth of self, I think that the more I sit and face these things, like even the day I left that hospice with the story I told you about, I went to my car and I sat in my car and I cried for a while for many reasons, because it really makes you face your own stuff. And I feel like every time I encounter something like that, I'm born again through that experience in a way. it helps me, it's like a refresher to my own mortality of like, okay, here is this thing, this is the reality, this is not happening only here in this room, it is happening everywhere right now, and you just happen to be here for this one. And so every time I am close to death or sit with that, it makes me feel as if I have come to a deeper understanding of myself.
Hi. Oh. I just have a question on if you've done any work with psychedelics and cancer survivors.
I have not. And so I would love to. That is actually part of my goal with doing the clinical research, even with the psychedelics here for treatment-resistant depression. I want to get my toes in there to touch on that because it resembles that similar thing, right? And I actually have a woman I know who is a palliative doctor, and they're going to be opening an end-of-life sanctuary. And so so it's like an end of life, so it would be even like a terminally, like we want to incorporate like psychedelic therapy into that.
But this would not be with end of life. This is people that went through cancer, survived,
Oh.
and it's gone,
Oh.
but then there's PTSD as a result of the
Yes,
cancer.
yes, I have.
And the grief of all the things that have happened as a result of
Yes.
going through cancer.
Yes, I have, actually.
Could you speak a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
so I have done some work with some folks who did have cancer diagnosis. They were, they went through the chemo and came through remission, but there is a lot of trauma that people experience in that space. And I actually had one in particular that I'm thinking of who had significant life trauma as is, and then also had cancer and went through these treatments and came out, and they said that they wish they would have known of the psychedelic therapy sooner than they did because they were sitting in that space in that process of going through chemo and feeling all these things with their existential anxiety, and they were not offered assistance in that. So when you're not only facing that thought of another person dying, but you're facing the thought of your own demise, there should be support provided, I think. And I'm not sure exactly what happens in all those cases. If people are referred to therapists, I know a lot of folks do generally tend to go to therapy, and they have that associated with like end-of-life care and cancer patients. So.
Hi, my question is that near-death experiences, I've had one, it seems like a psychedelic experience, death seems like a psychedelic experience, and for people who don't participate in medicinal mushrooms, that this might be one of their main psychedelic experiences in life. I'm wondering if you see or hear people describe, like, through my own grief, I'm watching hospice nurses talk about when people are about to die, they reach out to their relatives. And over and over, multiple people have said at different hospitals that your loved ones come to you and take you with them when they go. So have you experienced that? And do people describe it as a psychedelic experience? Or I'm interested to know that.
Yeah, thank you for that, actually. There's also people who will, when that's happening to patients who are dying, so this can start to happen actually 6 months prior to their death. So they can start to see people even up to that long. And oftentimes people will kind of chalk it up to saying like, oh, well, they're on all the, morphine, because they give a fair amount of morphine at the end of life. And so people will say the morphine is actually, it's what's causing it, or they're drugged, or, but morphine doesn't generally cause hallucinations, from what I know. And it's really beautiful because it's generally the people who come to greet them are people who've died already. And so when you ask that, it made my heart beat a little bit, because when the friend I told you about lost their father recently, when I sat them down and started to ask them questions, that's the first thing I asked them. Yeah, I said, I'm just really curious if you know at all if during that last part of your dad's life, if anyone came to him to bring him or greet him, someone who's died already. And he said no, he didn't know and wasn't sure. I said maybe he didn't talk about it because people don't always. And then that death deck game that I mentioned, actually one of the questions which I thought of and was going to ask if we had time was, if you are at the end of your life and you know that you are exiting, who do you think would be there? Who do you think the person would be to come and take you? I always joke and say it's going to be a party for me. There's going to be a bunch of them coming to take me with. But I do believe that is a very real thing. And then the end-of-life experiences too, going into that psychedelic space, so, or near-death experiences, sorry. The brain actually releases DMT upon death. And so a lot of like that actual death experience that people talk about being kind of like that hallucination and like, I'm going to this place, that could be due to that DMT that is exerted. And oftentimes people will also, this is one thing that my friend said his father was doing, they will, because they know they're going somewhere. They just don't necessarily always know where. And so oftentimes at end of life, and this is not even dementia, Alzheimer's, this is just really how they feel, they will say things like, I'm going on vacation, or I'm going on a trip, or I need to pack my suitcase, I'm going on a journey. And so they will want a suitcase packed to bring things they can't actually take with them. And so one of my questions actually for everyone in that same space is, what would you put in that suitcase? You can't actually take it with you. So what would you put in there? Sentimental items? I always joke and say I'd cram a bunch of people in there, but it wouldn't be big enough. So.
Thank you for this, and thank you for what you do.
Absolutely.
So you said taking psychedelics in acute grief is probably a bad idea. So what cues would somebody have to know when it is a good time to take it, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I do, and thank you, because I wanted to actually touch on that a little bit. So I have worked with people who are in the acute phase of grief, and I have watched psychedelics help them move through it. When I even say those things, I want you to know that that also goes into losses that are a little bit different, right? So like the loss of a child. Anyone who's lost a child, that is significant grief that can last so very long. And so that one for sure, that needs to be a waiting period because we don't want to spiritually bypass. And so I have done, I had a person once who had a loss. They knew they had anticipated was coming. They had their ketamine session actually scheduled with me that week. The day before their ketamine session, they decided to terminate that relationship entirely, and they were still very freshly grieving that. And so we had conversations, because this wasn't the first time I'd worked with them. We had done things in the past, and we knew each other pretty well, and so we talked about it. And it was a conversation had between myself and the patient. It's never my decision fully ever. It's an agreed upon thing between what they are comfortable with, and then you kind of assess like, okay, are they just trying to spiritually bypass? You can tell by certain things they may say, but it was, from what I saw in that day, it was really beautiful actually, even in that acute phase, but this was, you know, a loss of relationship as opposed to like a loss of a child, which they both hold grief. I'm not saying that they're not potentially equivalent, but the loss of something so significant can feel much heavier and more impactful.
I just have one more question. So I read that 100 years ago, most people died within their homes in the US. And then in the 50s, it was about 50%, and now we're at around 15% of people dying outside of a hospital setting. And I'm curious what your vision of the future of death care is, and how can we make death and dying in this country more easeful for people?
Thank you. Sorry. I have to go back to what was the question again? Sorry, I'm kind of tired today. Oh, the future death care. Oh yes, the dying in homes. So thank you for that. That's really interesting. So just a side note, when I go for walks in my neighborhood in the summer when it's dimly lit and I'm like kind of observing in homes, I'm always like, I wonder if anyone's died in that house. I wonder who's died in there. And I hope people have died in there is my next thought, because at home is more peaceful than being in a hospital setting. We are actually going more toward that again, which is really beautiful. There is an organization in the Twin Cities called the Minnesota Threshold Network, and they will give information about all of those things. And so when I started to go to their events, one of the things that I learned is that, and I was misled in this, I think a lot of people are, you can actually keep the body in the house up to 3 days. Anyone can just do that. If you have a family member in your home and you want to be there and you want to care for the body and you want to wash them and do all of those things and spend time with them, you actually can. I was misled in that, even to think, you know, as soon as someone dies, you call and you have them come and picked up immediately, but you actually don't have to. If you want that time and you need that time, you can spend it with them. And it's hopeful for me that that can become just a normal part of death again, actually. Like, die in the home with your family, the people that you want there that love you. There's also obviously some accommodation to that. If you have a body in your house, you're gonna have to keep it cool and keep the temperature down because decomposition and stuff like that. But you still, you're running that risk more after that few days, and that's why they say you can keep it for a couple days, like the person, but then you're gonna have to call someone to have them come and take them. And to speak with that, as well as the traditional funeral is dying, which might sound weird in the sentence, but I think green burials are becoming more common. There are so many ways. Cremation actually is far more used now than it was. The funeral industry, I think, is maybe even in a little state of panic, probably because so many people are deciding to be cremated. It's much cheaper. I don't know if any of you know the cost of these things, but cremation is about $2,000 to $3,000, and then traditional funeral, the cheapest I have seen was about $6,500, and that was the cheapest if you went with like lowest cost of everything. Most people, when they lose someone, they don't have that money sitting around. And I've watched people, when I've lost folks, scammer within their communities to get the money together to make sure they can bury this person. And that's outrageous. And so when it comes to things like green burials, like actually my death wish is to be cremated and then to be put into, it's called a bio urn. And so they actually bury the urn and they have a seed planted and like a tree grows from it. So you get planted into the earth and then a tree will grow. I always joke and say I want to be a cherry tree so that the cycle can keep going and I can feed the squirrels and all the stuff. But yeah. I really like that. Actually, you can't find it in a lot of places, and I'm hopeful that it will become more common. So another thing is like traditional cemeteries and burial spaces, which are beautifully landscaped and like peaceful. I actually go have dinner in cemeteries with my friends because it's a very peaceful place. But that is not for everyone. And so they actually have, I can't remember the name of the organization, I'd have to look it up, but there is a company that bought a whole bunch of land, like forested land, and you can actually go there and choose your spot to be at the base of, say, a tree or something like that. I have myself actually started to play with the idea of, like, what if I just had a cemetery? What if I had a green burial place? What if I had a place for people to go that was a beautiful garden and sanctuary where you can go and you can say, this is where I want my remains, and maybe a plaque is put there with your name or something. And then there's also some really cool stuff too. This is very future technology in death, but like you can do like holograms in memory, and like they're starting to do this thing where you can like make your own, and then before you die, you get to kind of tell your life story, and then it's held and kept that way, which is really, really cool. But yeah, technology is beautiful and wonderful, but not always great. But I really like it for that specifically because like when I do visit cemeteries, I think about that a lot actually, because I'll see graves that are a very long time ago, and I think, who even comes here anymore? Give it a couple generations in your family, and no one knows who you were, which is facing your mortality, like you asked me about earlier, right? Understanding and like feeling those things, but it's we could do better. I really believe that. So. Yeah.
Yeah, true.